Let's then consider how these major themes of the tension between business and environmental interests, the disagreements between partisans, Republican and Democrat, liberal, conservative, the different perspectives on truth of science, as well as the concerns over the shift from domestic to global issues, how they've translated into the major federal environmental policies we've seen throughout history. The 1960s were a watershed moment for environmental politics in the United States. Up to this point, the states had not been protecting the environment. Several key events ultimately sparked the first major policy change by the federal government as it related to the environment. In 1962, Rachel Carson published her book Silent Spring, talking about the indiscriminate and destructive use of pesticides, in particular the use of DDT and the killing of bird species. 1969, there was a Santa Barbara oil spill, the largest at the time. And further in 1969, the Cuyahoga River in Ohio caught fire due to the massive amount of pollution in it. I think of that event as the spark that really lit the fire dealing with environmental protection policy. So in 1969, Nixon at the point came out with three key policy concerns that he wanted to address. First, he wanted to declare a national policy which encourages productive and enjoyable harmony between man and the environment. Second, he wanted to promote efforts which would prevent or eliminate damage to the environment and stimulate health and welfare of man. Third, he wanted to enrich our understanding of ecological systems and natural resources and the importance of them to the nation. Although critics argue he made these 3 points to direct attention away from Vietnam, ultimately they culminated in the passage of NEPA, or the National Environmental Policy Act. This was the first major environmental policy change made in a significant period of time, and ultimately fundamentally changed the process of decision-making as it related to environmental policy. One of the most significant things it did was with dealing with federal action required environmental impact statements. In doing so, before federal action could take place, it had to offer an NOI, or a notice of intent. It had to give the purpose and the need for the government action. It had to consider alternatives as opposed to what they were planning. It had to think about the infected environment as well as the consequences to the environment from the federal action. And finally, it allowed for both comments and coordination with the public. This was a significant change at this point, but these policies and procedures enacted through NEPA are still in use today. This act and the creation of the EPA really did open the floodgates for a series of environmental protection statutes that followed in the years to come. The first, starting in 1970, was the Clean Air Act, dealing with air quality standards and auto emissions limitations. In particular, these are your CAFE standards. They were put in place to deal with acid rain in the Northeast, where you had lakes and rivers that were completely devoid of life from acid rain. In 1972, the Clean Water Act was passed to regulate surface water and deal with impaired waters. Basically, this created the waters of the United States, which helped us understand fishing and swimmable water, or otherwise known as non-navigable waters. But in recent time, this has caused a significant controversy, in particular in the South during the rainy season. These temporary pools of surface water have allowed the federal government significant authority into farmlands and private property. 1972, we also saw the Insecticide, Fungicide, and Roticide Act, really in particular dealing with food safety and what can actually be getting into your food. This is expanded today into things like, well, peanut butter. As gross as it sounds, this act gave the FDA the ability to regulate things like what gets into your food. Do you know that there's a certain allowance of insect fragments and rodent hairs that are allowed in every jar of peanut butter? Peanut butter today can have 30 or more insect fragments per 100 grams and 1 or more rodent hairs for every 100 grams. So think of it this way. An 18-ounce jar of peanut butter has 510 grams, meaning that every jar is allowed to have 150 plus insect fragments and 5 or more rodent hairs. Additionally, in 1974, Congress passed the Safe Drinking Water Act, giving the EPA the ability to determine the level of contaminants in drinking water at which no adverse health effects are likely to occur. While initially put in place to deal with waterborne illnesses like Legionnaire's disease, The Safe Drinking Water Act has been expanded to allow the EPA, and state governments in particular, to deal with things like adding fluoride to water, and recently to deal with things like the Flint, Michigan water crisis. The federal government then put in a slew of acts meant to deal with hazardous and toxic wastes, in particular the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, the Toxic Substance Control Act, and the Superfund Act of 1980. Basically, these gave the federal government oversight into both the distribution and disposal of hazardous waste, as well as through the Superfund Act, or areas that were highly contaminated from pollution from private businesses, gave them authority to regulate cleanup of these areas as well too. However, oversight hasn't kept pace with science and rapid expansion in the production of chemicals. Today, many companies don't even have to clear even basic safety reviews before using chemicals included in their products.